September 2nd, 2025. Southern Caribbean Sea. A small fishing boat from Venezuela races through international waters, carrying four 200-horsepower engines and 11 men. U.S. Navy warships have been tracking it for hours. Then, without warning, the sky erupts. In seconds, the boat is obliterated. All 11 people aboard are killed instantly. There are no arrests, no interdictions, no survivors. Just a precision airstrike that makes history as the first U.S. military attack on a boat in Latin America since the invasion of Panama in 1989. This is the true story of Operation Caribbean Thunder, the day the drug war became a shooting war. To understand what happened that morning, you need to know what was happening in the waters off Venezuela. August 2025 had seen the largest U.S. military buildup in the Caribbean in 60 years. Over 10,000 troops, 8 warships, F-35 fighter jets, nuclear submarines, B-52 bombers. This wasn't a training exercise, this was a show of force. The USS Iwo Jima Amphibious Ready Group departed Naval Station Norfolk, Virginia on August 14, 2025. The battle group included 3 massive ships, the Wasp-class amphibious assault ship USS Iwo Jima, and 2 San Antonio-class amphibious transport docks, the USS San Antonio and USS Fort Lauderdale. Together, they carried over 4,500 sailors and 2,200 Marines from the 22nd Marine Expeditionary Unit. But that was just the beginning. Guided missile destroyers USS Jason Dunham, USS Gravely, and USS Sampson took up positions across the Caribbean. The guided missile cruiser USS Lake Erie joined them. The nuclear-powered attack submarine USS Newport News prowled beneath the surface. The littoral combat ship USS Minneapolis St. Paul patrolled the shallows. The fleet was equipped with Tomahawk cruise missiles, AV-8B Harrier jump jets, MH-60 Seahawk helicopters, and MV-22 Osprey tiltrotor aircraft. P-8 Poseidon reconnaissance planes flew overhead, scanning the ocean with advanced radar. MQ-9 Reaper drones circled at high altitude, their cameras watching everything. This was the most powerful naval force assembled in the Caribbean since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And everyone knew why they were there. Venezuela. President Donald Trump had declared war on the cartels. In February 2025, his administration designated multiple criminal organizations as foreign terrorist organizations. Tren de Aragua, the Venezuelan prison gang that had spread across South America. MS-13, the Sinaloa cartel, Cartel de los Soles, which the U.S. claimed was run by Venezuelan government officials. Trump doubled the bounty on Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro to $50 million. He accused Maduro of being one of the largest drug traffickers in the world, directly controlling gangs like Tren de Aragua to destabilize the United States. Maduro denied everything. In late August, as U.S. warships appeared on the horizon, he called on Venezuelans to join militias to defend the country. He said the greatest military threat to Venezuela in 100 years was unfolding. He warned that no empire would touch Venezuelan soil. The stage was set for confrontation. September 1st, 2025. Sunday night. The small fishing town of San Juan de Unare on Venezuela's Paria Peninsula. For 20 years, this village had been quietly transformed into a drug trafficking hub. Everyone knew it. No one talked about it. A boat prepared to depart. It was called a flipper, about 12 meters long and 2.5 meters wide. Powered by 4 massive 200-horsepower outboard engines, it could reach the speeds over 50 knots. Low profile, fast, built to evade radar and outrun law enforcement. 11 men boarded. 8 were from San Juan de Unare. 3 came from the nearby town of Guiria. They weren't cartel kingpins. They were fishermen. Desperate men from impoverished communities where fishing alone meant starvation. They had been offered money, probably a few $1,000s each, to make a run to Trinidad and Tobago, just 60 miles north across the Caribbean. In the cargo hold, sources later reported, was a considerable amount of cocaine. The boat departed under darkness. Its destination, Trinidad. The route was well known. Hundreds of similar runs had been made before. Most were successful. Some were intercepted by the Coast Guard and arrested, but this time would be different. U.S. Navy reconnaissance aircraft picked up the vessel almost immediately. P-8 Poseidons tracked its course. The intelligence was relayed to the fleet. This was the moment the operation had been waiting for. September 2nd, 2025. Early morning. The boat was in international waters heading north. It had traveled over 60 miles from the Venezuelan coast, well beyond Venezuela's 12 nautical mile territorial limit. According to later reports, U.S. forces issued 3 warnings in English, Spanish, and Portuguese, ordering the vessel to stop. There is no confirmation the crew heard these warnings or understood them. What happened next is where the accounts diverge. The Trump administration would later claim the boat refused to stop and exhibited threatening behavior. They said intelligence confirmed the vessel was carrying narcotics and was operated by members of Tren de Aragua, the designated terrorist organization. But no boarding was attempted, no Coast Guard intercept, no shots across the bow. Instead, a U.S. military aircraft moved into position and launched a precision strike. The boat exploded. Eyewitness accounts from Trinidad describe seeing a flash of light on the horizon, then hearing a distant boom. Within seconds, the vessel was engulfed in flames. All 11 men died on impact. Their bodies were never recovered. Hours later, President Trump announced the strike from the White House. He posted a video on Truth Social showing aerial footage of the attack. The grainy black and white thermal imagery shows the boat moving across the water. Then, a flash. An explosion. The vessel consumed by fire, dead in the water. Trump wrote, "Earlier this morning on my orders, U.S. military forces conducted a kinetic strike against positively identified Tren de Aragua, narco-terrorists in the Southcom area of responsibility. TDA is a designated foreign terrorist organization operating under the control of Nicolas Maduro, responsible for mass murder, drug trafficking, sex trafficking, and acts of violence and terror across the United States and Western Hemisphere. The strike resulted in 11 terrorists killed in action. No U.S. forces were harmed in this strike. Please let this serve as notice to anybody even thinking about bringing drugs into the United States of America. Beware." Secretary of State Marco Rubio confirmed the operation, calling it a lethal strike against a designated narco-terrorist vessel. He said the mission would continue. Instead of interdicting it, on the president's orders, we blew it up, and it'll happen again. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth added that the strikes would not stop until the attacks on the American people were over. The reaction was immediate and divided. Venezuela's government initially claimed the video was fake, generated by artificial intelligence. Communications Minister Freddy Ñañez said the attack never occurred. Attorney General Tarek William Saab repeated the denial. Interior Minister Diosdado Cabello called it extrajudicial murder and said investigations showed none of the 11 dead were members of Tren de Aragua. But the families in San Juan de Unare told a different story. Within hours, Venezuelan social media was flooded with tributes. San Juan de Unare in mourning. May those fathers rest in peace. They entered that world out of necessity so their families could live a little better. Photos of the dead circulated. Grieving relatives confirmed the men were on the boat. They were not hardened criminals. They were fathers, brothers, sons. Journalist Rana Rizquez, an expert on Tren de Aragua, who had written a book on the gang, confirmed that San Juan de Unare had been under the influence of traffickers for years. But she also noted that the men on the boat were likely low-level couriers, not gang members. Cesar Batiz, director of the independent Venezuelan news outlet El Pitazo, verified the details based on sources in the region. International reaction was swift. Colombian President Gustavo Petro condemned the strike as an extrajudicial killing. He argued that suspects should have been arrested, not executed at sea. He later suggested that any attack on Venezuela would be considered an attack on Latin America. Trinidad and Tobago's prime minister took the opposite view, praising the U.S. action. She said drug traffickers brought violence to her islands and the strike sent a necessary message. Legal experts were divided. International law professors warned that the strike could violate both U.S. and international law. The United States was not in a declared armed conflict with Venezuela or Tren de Aragua. The individuals on the boat were not lawful military combatants. Labeling them terrorists did not automatically make them valid military targets. Others pointed out that drug interdictions in the Caribbean are typically carried out by the U.S. Coast Guard. Arrests and seizures are common. The use of lethal force to destroy a boat without presenting evidence, without attempting arrest, was unprecedented in peacetime. The Trump administration defended the strike by invoking the February designation of Tren de Aragua as a foreign terrorist organization. In October, the Pentagon sent a letter to Congress stating that Trump had determined the U.S. was in an armed conflict with drug cartels. This legal framework, they argued, gave the military authority to use lethal force. But critics pointed out the circular logic. Designating a group as terrorists, then declaring armed conflict with them, then using that declaration to justify strikes without due process. Constitutional scholars warn that this set a dangerous precedent, allowing the executive branch to bypass Congress and international law. The strikes did not stop. September 15, 2025. Another boat, 3 more dead. September 19th, 3 more. October 3rd, 4 killed. October 15th, 6 dead. October 17th, 2 more with survivors captured. By late October, at least 34 people had been killed in these operations. Each time the Trump administration released videos. Each time they claimed the vessels were carrying drugs and were operated by terrorists. Each time they provided no physical evidence, no recovered narcotics, no captured suspects to face trial. The escalation continued beyond the strikes. On September 4th, 2 Venezuelan F-16 fighter jets buzzed the USS Jason Dunham in what the Pentagon called a highly provocative act. The U.S. responded by deploying 10 F-35 fighter jets and 2 MQ-9 Reaper drones to Puerto Rico. On October 15th, 3 B-52 strategic bombers capable of carrying nuclear weapons flew for hours off the coast of Venezuela in a massive show of force. It was a message. The United States had the capability to strike anywhere in Venezuela at any time. Venezuelan Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino told his military that the U.S. government knew the drug trafficking accusations were false. He said the true intent was regime change. The irrationality with which the U.S. empire operates is not normal, he warned. It's anti-political, anti-human, warmongering. Maduro declared his military was on maximum alert. Russian-supplied air defense systems were activated. Troops mobilized along the coast. The Venezuelan president said he was ready to declare a state of emergency. Tensions reached a point where analysts openly discussed the possibility of war. Not a drug war, an actual military conflict. But what about the 11 men who died on September 2nd? Their names were eventually revealed. 8 from San Juan de Unari, 3 from Guerrilla. Not terrorists, not cartel members. Fishermen who had turned to drug running because poverty left them no choice. In one of the poorest regions of Venezuela, where a month's wages from fishing wouldn't feed a family, a single drug run could earn more than a year of honest work. One neighbor told reporters, "Many make the mistake because they are in dire need. Need forces them to do anything, and since the government doesn't come here to help, what is one supposed to do?" After the strike, San Juan de Unari fell silent. The flow of money stopped. Restaurants closed. People stopped buying. Fear spread. Fishermen were terrified to go out to sea. They didn't know if they would be mistaken for smugglers and blown out of the water. The harsh reality is this: the people who died in these strikes were the lowest rung of a multi-billion-dollar industry. Replaceable, expendable. For every boat destroyed, 10 more would take its place. For every courier killed, 20 desperate men would line up for the job. The economics are overwhelming. Cocaine that costs $1,000 per kilogram in Colombia sells for $30,000 in the United States. That 3,000% markup makes every loss acceptable. Every boat, every crew, every shipment is just the cost of doing business. Since 2020, the U.S. Coast Guard has interdicted over 1,000 metric tons of cocaine in the Caribbean. Thousands of people have been arrested, dozens of vessels seized or destroyed, but the drugs keep flowing. Because as long as demand exists in the United States, supply will find a way. The September 2nd strike was not a victory in the drug war. It was a statement, a demonstration of power, a message to Maduro, and perhaps, as some analysts suggested, a step towards something much larger: regime change in Venezuela. Former U.S. Navy Admiral James Stavridis wrote that drug interdiction was likely not the sole reason for the military buildup. He characterized the strikes and naval deployment as gunboat diplomacy, intended to demonstrate the vulnerability of Venezuelan oil infrastructure and military assets. Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado seemed to confirm this. She said the U.S. deployment encouraged tens of thousands of Venezuelans to join an underground movement aimed at overthrowing Maduro. She called the 2024 Venezuelan election fraudulent and said regime change was necessary, though she insisted it should be led by Venezuelans, not the United States. By mid-October, analysts agreed. What began as counter-narcotics operations had transformed into something else. The focus had shifted from stopping drugs to pressuring the Venezuelan government. The legal justifications became thinner. The international condemnation grew louder. On October 17th, Admiral Alvin Holsey, commander of U.S. Southern Command, announced he was retiring early. He had been in the position less than a year. The typical term is 3 years. Sources said Holsey had expressed reservations about the ongoing operations and had clashed with Defense Secretary Hegseth. It was unclear whether his objections were legal, strategic, or ethical. But his sudden departure spoke volumes. The operation that began on September 2nd, 2025 continues today. More boats have been struck, more people have died. The U.S. military presence in the Caribbean remains at historic levels. Venezuela's military stands on high alert, and in San Juan de Unare, families mourn 11 men who will never come home. This was not the first time the United States used military force in Latin America, and it will not be the last. But it marked a fundamental shift in how America wages the war on drugs, from law enforcement to military strikes, from arrests to assassinations, from due process to kinetic operations. Was it legal? International lawyers say no. Was it effective? The drugs are still flowing. Was it just? 11 families are still grieving, and the questions remain. What happens when a nation designates its enemies, declares war without Congress, and kills suspects without trial? What happens when the line between law enforcement and warfare disappears? On September 2nd, 2025, that line vanished in the Caribbean Sea, in a flash of fire, in 11 lives lost, in a precedent that may define American military action for years to come. The war on drugs is no longer about interdiction, it's about airstrikes. And somewhere tonight, another boat is preparing to leave Venezuela. Another crew of desperate men willing to risk everything, and another military planner is watching, waiting, calculating the moment to strike. The September 2nd operation was historic, the first airstrike on a boat in Latin America in 36 years. But it will not be the last. The strikes continue, the tensions escalate, and the Caribbean, once a paradise of crystal blue water and endless horizons, has become a battlefield. This was the true story of September 2nd, 2025, a date that changed everything. The day America crossed a line, and 11 men from a small Venezuelan fishing village paid the price.